turn on the okay. Firstly, good evening. Tonight's shiur should be Li'uli Nishmat Avi Mari Dov Ber Meir Ben Reuven Halevi Ivi Melrati Brachel Bat Harav Michael, and the merit of our learning should be a refuah shlema for Chanukela Bat Sarah Leah, as well as we hope that Kadosh Baruch Hu is watching and will send a Yeshua to all of the Jews of Ukraine and the people who are involved, who are non-Jewish, who are also created by Hashem, who are involved in this seemingly, at least from my perspective, wanton and unnecessary conflict. Let's move on from there. Okay. I started with a slide called Megillat Esther because I really want to start with those two words, Megillat Esther, and ask everybody, if I were to ask you to translate Megillat Esther, how many of you would say the scroll of Esther? How many would you say with the book of Esther? How many would say something other than the book of Esther or the scroll of Esther? And the answer, I think, is nobody's raising their hand to the last question. And if it was the book of Esther, it would be Sefer Esther. As a matter of fact, this is one of 5 books in the Tanakh that are called Megillot. But I think this is the original. If you ask anybody, you just say Megillah, as the Talmud does. The Masechta Megillah talks about Purim. So the tractate called Purim is labeled Megillah. However, I think Megillat Esther really has another meaning. Just like everything else about Purim that has what I will call the literal open meaning, there's also the hidden behind the scenes that you have to study and look for meaning, because that's what the whole story of Purim is about. Everything is Topsy Turvy, everything is upside down, and everything is hidden, including the name of Hashem, which is hidden, doesn't appear. It's the only one of the 24 books of the Tanakh in which Hashem's name does not appear. I hope I'll get into a little bit why that might be. But I think if we really look for the meaning of Megillat Esther, I will ask you what the word Megillat means. What's the root of Megillat? And I will tell you that the word Megillat is really the my brain just went dead. I forgot the word. The linkage. It's the word when it's linked to something else. Or the real word is Megillah. The tough is added when it becomes Megillat something. What's the term for that? I can't think of. Possessive. Okay. When it's possessive as Megillat something, then it becomes Megillat. Megillat Kohelet. But when it's just the word is Megillah. And the root of Megillah, I think, is Gimel Lamed Hey, Legalot, to reveal. Now, interestingly enough, I think it's called Megillah because it was a scroll rolled up. Why is a scroll called a Megillah? Because when it's rolled up, we don't see anything. In order to reveal what's written in it, you have to unroll it. So too, we have a wave in the ocean. For those of you who are into surfing, not on the internet, is called a gal. Gal, again, because it's something that's curved up, that's something that has a hidden force behind it that you might not realize unless you're a surfer. Then you'd love that hidden force because that's what propels you. So the Megillat really means the revealing of, and Esther means, we think, the name Esther. But we're going to find out in a minute when we start going through Megillat Esther, that Esther really means hidden.
Hidden.
Okay, it's from Seter. Esther is not really a name. I suspect it's become a name because of the story of Esther. She's probably the first person who had that name. Although there are those that want to translate Esther back to names of different deities as Astahar, who was a Persian deity. But I think it's more related, as the Talmud wants to say. The Talmud asks, where do we have an allusion to the story of Purim, of the story of Esther, specifically in the Torah, and the verse that is quoted, Anochi haster astir panai bayom hahu, I will hide my face on that day. On the day the Jews forsake me and they're in exile, I will turn my back on them, or I will hide my face from them. Kivyachol, if it's possible for Hashem to hide from us. But again, this concept of Seter, something that is hidden. So I would translate Megillat Esther as the revealing of that which is hidden. In addition, of course, to the scroll of Esther. But I think that's a very interesting introduction to our lesson for tonight about Megillat Esther. And I hope my mouse will keep working properly. Here we go. Okay, the four primary characters. Everybody knows who the four primary characters in Megillat Esther are. They are, of course, in order of appearance, as we do with any correct thing you have to do, is Achashverosh is one of the first character was introduced as a primary character. Now, there are other secondary characters who get introduced in chapter 1 and don't appear the rest of the way. There are the 7 who come to call the queen. Firstly, there's Queen Vashti. Then there is the 7 advisors who are, or the 7 chamberlains whose job it is to go represent the king and call the queen to come to this banquet. She refuses. There are the 7 advisors who come to advise the king what to do about Vashti. So there are lots of names that show up in the first chapter. But as I said, the primary character of the book that shows up in the first chapter is Achashverosh. In chapter 2, we are introduced to Mordechai and Esther. And then finally in chapter 3, we are introduced, of course, to the 4th primary character, Haman. As I said, there are other secondary characters who appear throughout the book. There are, of course, the king's officers, Haggai and Shashgaz, who are in charge of the various sections of the harem. There are, of course, Bigtan and Teresh, the 2 conspirators whose conspiracy plays a seemingly nominal role in the plot, but will become a very critical role when the time comes. And of course, our most beloved character, Zeresh, the advisor or ill advisor, as the case may be, to Haman. And of course, later on, when we finally get to the end of the story, we find 10 of Haman's sons listed by name. So it's a very book that's full of names. But as I said, we go back to the 4 primary characters. Now, you'll notice there are numbers in parentheses after each of these characters. The name Achashverosh appears 29 times in Megillat Esther, 15 of which, that's why the minus 15, 15 of which are Hamelech Achashverosh. So I don't want you to think but the word Hamelech alone appears 181 minus 15, 166 times. And there are those among the commentaries who want to say that every time it uses the word Hamelech only, while it is referring to the earthly king Achashverosh, it's also referring in some sense to the heavenly king as being involved in the story. If you happen to be a sofer or you happen to own a kosher Megillah and you look carefully, you will find that with the exception of the first column and the last 3 columns, every column begins with the word Hamelech if it's a Megillah that is written according to the general tradition of writing Megillot. And again, that's because Hamelech is very much the theme word of the Megillah. And I think the hidden theme of that concept of Hamelech, and as I said before, Hashem's name not appearing, is that oftentimes we think that the king is in charge, but in reality, it's really there's a king behind the scenes that we don't always see, and sometimes we aren't aware of until we look back at things in retrospect and realize that, oh, there was a heavenly hand guiding all that's going on. So again, Achashverosh, as I mentioned, 29 times, 15 of those 29 times it says Hamelech Achashverosh, the other 14 it just says Achashverosh, and then the word Hamelech appears throughout the Megillah as very, very much a theme word. Mordechai is mentioned 58 times, Esther 55, and Haman is 54. So if you look in terms of distribution, clearly Achashverosh is the primary character in the story. Mordechai, Esther, and Haman seem to be equally distributed. However, one of the things that I thought was very interesting in terms of Megillat Esther is the way each of these characters are introduced in the first time we see them. So that's what you're going to see right below. The first verse where this character is mentioned. And the first verse Achashverosh mentions obviously is the first book of the story. And it's interesting, he's introduced as Vayibim Achashverosh. It was in the days of Achashverosh. Then it asks who Achashverosh. It says, it adds, well, oh, if you're not sure which Achashverosh we're talking about the Achashverosh that was the king or ruled from Hodu through Kush over 127 countries. Doesn't tell us anything about his lineage, doesn't tell us anything about his background, doesn't give us any accolades about who he is as a person. We know he is the king. That's it. And many of the commentaries, or I guess the when we forget the commentaries and we go back to our preconceived, the story Purim, we all know it from the time we're kids. And we have these pictures in our head. Achashverosh, I always think people think of Achashverosh as Hans Holbein's Henry VIII, this fat, jolly, manipulative, easily manipulated king who all he wants to do is live and let live, except if you challenge my throne, then I got to just off with your head. It's very simple. So it's kind of like a combination of Henry VIII maybe and the Queen of Hearts in Alice in Wonderland to a kid. That's the way we picture Achashverosh. And yet Achashverosh, as we go through it, it's going to be very interesting. We're going to find lots of times that Achashverosh is doing lots of things. He's the first event we have in the Megillat Esther is he is doing, he is making, he is active. He seems to be a very active king, but we don't read a whole lot about his policies, about his legislation, about his ruling. We sort of find out about his ruling from things that happen. Now, again, we have to understand that the purpose of this book isn't to give us a biography of Achashverosh. It's not to give us a political history of the Persian Empire under Achashverosh. So the fact that we have very little about him before we even introduce the story is not abnormal. There's no reason that we should say it's abnormal. It's very interesting in the way it contrasts to the other three characters that we're going to see. One final thought about Achashverosh, and that we just have to understand that Achashverosh it has two different perspectives as we look at him. One is, as I said, is this king who seems to be able to take everything in stride, with, as I said, the exception that anything that impinges on his royal authority is met immediately and decisively. Okay, that's the only thing that we get out of Achashverosh, I think, from chapter 1. We're going to see a little bit later some other ironic things about Achashverosh and about the whole Megillat Esther story as we move on. Okay, Mordechai is introduced in a very, very different way. He's introduced firstly by a nomenclature. Each Yehudi, Haya b'Shushan HaBirah, there was this Yehudi, which we would today translate as Jew. There was this Jew in Shushan who lived in Shushan HaBirah, Shushan the capital, Ushmal, and his name was Mordechai ben Yair ben Shimi ben Kish, and then it says Ish Yemini, a man of Yemini means he was a righty, but no, Yemini literally means a Benjaminite, at least the way most people translate that, and which seems conflicting with the fact that he's Ish Yehudi, because we know that Ish Yehudi literally means a Judean, a person from the tribe of Judah. And the Talmud goes into all discussions whether he's from the tribe of Judah or from the tribe of Benjamin, and not really relevant to the story. But the important thing, I think, is that Ish Yehudi is, by the time of this, is really to give us a setting of the time period. By this period in time, all of the Jewish exiles were already going by this name of Yehudi. That Yehudi seems to have already been a nomenclature that is applied to Jews. And if you ask me how long have we been called Jews, I would tell you it probably dates from the temple exile period, the exile after the first temple, because up until that time, people who generally were associated with their tribes rather than being Jews. They were a member of each tribe. And the reason we kind of get the name Yehudi as Jew, which as a Jew comes from Jude, which comes from Judah, is because the majority of the exiles were from the tribe of Judah, because that was the exile, that was just the demographics of the remaining Jews who stayed when the kingdom was split in two after Solomon's death. the majority of those that stayed loyal to the house of David was the tribe, his own tribe, the tribe of Yehudah. Yes, there was also Binyamin. There were also some Kohanim, some Leviim. After Chizkiyahu's reign, there were probably a smattering from the other Shvatim also that joined, but the majority were Yehudim, and that seems to be the nomenclature that has stuck with us throughout for the last 2,500 years. Okay. We also note that we get his descent. Mordechai, he has a father, he has a grandfather, he seemingly has a descent from a tribe. So we learn a little bit more about him. And in the immediately following verse, it tells us even more about him. How did he get to Shushan Abira? He was not born there. He's not a native Shushanite. Asher Aglami Yerushalayim. He had been exiled from Jerusalem with the Gola, Asher Haglatai Yechoniah Melech Judah, with the exile that was exiled with Yechoniah, the king of Judah, which Nebuchadnezzar had exiled. By the way, this exile of Nebuchadnezzar was not the destruction of the temple exile. It was the exile that preceded it by 11 years. King Yechoniah was 11 years prior to the destruction of the temple, where a number of the people had been already exiled. Mordechai was included in that first exile. So he's been living in Shushan for quite some time. But again, he is not a native Shushanite. He is a native of Jerusalem, which I think is interesting that the Megillah wants us to know that's an important fact that we have to know. It also sort of ties us back to the fact of putting this in a historical perspective, that the Jews are in Shushan not because they chose to live there, but because they were exiled there, which seems to be almost a double-edged sword, because we know that Achashverosh is a ruler after Koresh, and we know that Koresh was the one who gave the Jews permission to go back to Eretz Yisrael and to resettle within a period of 45 or 50 years after the destruction of the temple. And there were Jews who obviously, as we see, Mordechai did not choose to take up Koresh on that offer and stayed in Golah. So there's a lot of parallels, a lot of lessons for us to learn today by the fact that this whole story is taking place and is specifically set in the exile, but in a time where Jews are being allowed to move back to Eretz Yisrael. So there's some lessons to be learned from that. I hope we'll get to them before time runs out. Okay. The third character was introduced is, by the way, we call her Esther throughout, except for the first time she's introduced. First time she's introduced, Vayhi Omein, Mordechai, who we've just introduced, and we've introduced a little bit about him. He happened to be Omein. He was responsible for Hadassah. Who is Hadassah? Oh, well, he Esther Bas Dodo. She was Esther, the daughter of his uncle. But her name is Hadassah. Her real name is Hadassah. She's called Esther, and I suspect that even though Megillah here refers to her as Esther immediately upon introducing her, that her name Esther is given to her by Mordechai when she is entered into the pageant, because he does not want everybody to hear her name Hadassah, which I guess is a much more Hebrew name than Esther. Of course, if you ask everybody today which is more Hebrew, Hadassah or Esther, I think you get a very different response. But in those days, Hadassah clearly was clearly recognizable as a Jewish name, while Esther is not recognizable as a Jewish name. Again, Esther, as I said at the beginning, is hidden. So her name really is hidden. Hidden, the son of his uncle, or the daughter of his uncle. She is hidden. Her name is hidden. And that's really, if you think about it, while yes, as I said, the Persians may have said, oh, Esther sounds like Estahar, who was this Persian deity, and that would make sense because we know lots of people are named after deities back then. That would have made sense, but clearly Mordechai seemingly gives her this name as to hide her identity. Okay, but again, it introduces her. We're told a little about her. Why did Mordechai adopt her, or why was Mordechai her guardian? Because her parents had both died. She had no father or mother, Vanara, and it even tells us a little about her. She was Yifat Tohar v'Tovat Mar'eh. She was beautiful, good. When her parents died, Mordechai had adopted her as a daughter. That's the literal meaning. The Gemara wants to read something else into that, Labat, meaning that they were married, but that's the Medrash that the Gemara says the literal meaning is she was his adopted daughter as his niece. But even so, in either case, the fact of the matter is we see a little bit about this person, who she is, where she comes from, and the fact that she is an orphan with no parents is immediately impressed upon us at the beginning. Is that something that is a critical component? I think from a psychological perspective, it is, because it cuts both. Again, it's a double-edged sword, like everything in Megillat Esther. I could say, well, she has no parents, she has no family, so when she gets taken to the palace and she's the queen, she doesn't care about the other Jews. We can all say, oh, who cares? She doesn't care about us. On the other hand, by the fact that she's been adopted by Mordechai and cared for by this Jewish community, when she could have been a homeless waif, would cut the exact opposite way, that she would have an affinity to the Jews. She would certainly have an affinity to Mordechai and a gratitude toward Mordechai. So again, like everything I think in the Megillah, it's a double-edged cutting sword, cuts both ways. Okay. And finally, our fourth main character, as I said at the beginning, is of course none other than Haman. And he is introduced at the beginning of chapter 3, after Esther in chapter 2 has already been ensconced as queen, and Mordechai has already uncovered the plot that we referenced at the beginning of Bitan Teresh and saved the king's life. So then, Achar Adrim Ha'ela, we have this introduction of Haman. And Haman is introduced again, very interestingly. Mordechai is introduced the fact there was this person, and he had Esther. Haman is introduced on the scene almost like out of nowhere. All these the events that we've already recorded happened. Suddenly, this Haman, excuse me, whoever is, somebody is not muted. If you could please mute, because there's a lot of noise in the background. Thank you. I don't know who's making it, or is that me? I'm making that noise? I don't think so. Okay. Okay, so Haman is introduced almost out of nowhere. He becomes the chief cook and bottle washer of the king. He becomes the second in command to the king. No introduction before, nothing about him, but we are told a little bit. He is Ben Hamdan Ha'agagi. Now, if we study Jewish history, hold on.
To know that you listen to it extremely loud.
No, the stage. It's slow.
Excuse me, sorry about that. Let's go back to the screen share. Where are we here? Okay. Apologize for the interruption. Okay, so Haman is introduced as Ha'agagi. Those who studied Jewish history, Book of Samuel, we know that Agag, or listen to Torah last Shabbos, know that Agag is the king of Amalek, who we were to say that the Jews have an arch enemy, it would be Amalek. So Haman is already introduced as Ha'agagi, the Agagite, whether he was biologically or by or not is really irrelevant, because we see from his action that he clearly was a spiritual follower of God. And again, as I said, he's introduced literally out of nowhere. He suddenly becomes, boom, second in command. So it's a rather interesting difference, I think, in the way the characters are introduced, Haman and Achashverosh, sort of out of nowhere, versus Mordechai and Esther, where we're given a little bit more background. Now, clearly, obviously, the author has a little bit of bias toward Mordechai and Esther, given that this book is being written by none other than Mordechai and Esther. At least that's the way it appears from the superscription at the end of the book. So we would understand why they might, not be willing to give, or might not have the information about Achashverosh and Haman that they include about themselves. But clearly, also, we have to understand that the book here is being written, again, it's a double-edged sword. The book is being written. It's being written clearly for a Jewish audience. That's clear throughout the entire book, that the intended audience is the Jewish people. But at the same time, it's being written under Persian control. The Jews are in Persia. They're living by the grace of the king in Persia without being, persecuted and thrown into jail or thrown out of the country. And so they have to clearly be aware of that. And clearly, there are places in the book where we can see that tension between as I say, the audience they're trying to address, and the fact that they know they have to be wary of censorship or offending the king. That shows in a number of places. I don't know that we're going to get to any of them, but that's clear, I think is evident clearly at the beginning right away in the way the four main characters are introduced. Okay. I wanted to then go to one of my favorite themes about Megillat Esther is Megillat Esther timeline. Because when you ask most people, how long does the whole story take? I don't know. I have no idea. And if we look at the story, it seems as though there are a number of threads that are just kind of pulled out of nowhere that seem to just all be tied together. And we say, well, why is this part of the story? What does that have to do with the story? Clearly, the whole story with Vashti, what does that have to do with? Why is that all in the story? The whole chapter with the king having this party and Vashti, and who needs that? That's not part of the story. Why do we need to have the whole story about how Esther gets picked as queen? We don't need it. Maybe the part about how Mordecai uncovers the conspiracy might be important because it gives us a reference later on when that story suddenly becomes a key point in the plot. But if we look at the way seemingly different things are twined together, why are they there? We're going to get to that in a minute, I hope, but let's first go through the actual chronology. By the way, for those of you who want to know from the beginning, the first verse to the last verse is a period of approximately 10 years, is the entire, or maybe 11 years, is the entire story of Esther. And it starts, as we see below, the book tells us. It tells us in chapter 1 that chapter 1 happens in the third year of the king's reign. In the third year of Achashverosh's reign. By the way, they didn't have calendars that said 25 or 50 or 500 BCE. Third year of the king's reign. Things were dated by reigns of the king. That's how historical records were kept. So the third year of the king's reign, he has this big party. That's Esther chapter 1 happens in the third year. We don't really know when the second chapter begins, except that it's Achar Advarim Ha'ela, sometime after the third year, and that's pretty obvious because the beginning of chapter 2 and most of chapter 2, it tells us about the fact that Achashverosh wakes up and he's missing Vashti. Where did she go? What happened to her? Well, we know because we read the first chapter. Achashverosh may not have remembered because he probably was stone drunk, and we have no idea how much he remembered. What happened to Vashti. And by the way, if I were to take a poll and say what happened to Vashti, I don't know what different possibilities we would get, but the Megillah doesn't tell us. It just tells us that she's no longer going to be queen, whether she was sent into banishment to Siberia or thrown into off a pit into a prison where she couldn't get out of. I don't know. We don't know what her fate was. It just was that she was no longer queen. And therefore, Achashverosh needed a new queen. The presumption is that she was killed somehow or executed somehow, because if not, the first thing we would have assumed, they would have said, oh, well, why don't you call her back from the banishment if you miss her so much? Would have been the first response of the people who give him the suggestion to hold this beauty pageant and find a new queen. The presumption is that Vashti was either had so become persona non grata among the palace staff also, or that she literally was had been executed. I think that's the assumption most people make, is that she was executed. But there's nowhere where it says it because it's not necessarily relevant to the storyline. Okay, so we know that chapter 2 starts sometime after that, and we know that by the time Esther becomes queen, it's the 7th year of the king's reign. So 4 years have passed. Now, did it take him 4 years to forget Vashti and Esther was picked right away? Did it take 2 years and then 2 years till Esther was picked? We don't know. But we do know that she meets Achashverosh after, remember, she had to go through a year of beauty treatments before that. So the 7th year of the king's reign, she gets to the palace, and apparently she never leaves because after that she's picked as queen. Again, the next chapter that we read about in terms of timeline is Bayamim Hahem, sometime during that time. Again, no definitive time. By the way, this is the introduction to Mordecai overhearing the plot to kill the king and revealing it, and the conspirators are hanged, and the plot is recorded in the King's Chronicles. That happens obviously sometime between the 7th year of the king's reign and the next thing that happens, which is Achar Advarim Ha'ela. Chapter 3 begins with those words that after these things was when Achashverosh promotes Haman. And we know that Haman is in power when we get to the 12th year of the king's reign, he is still in power. Okay, because in the 12th year, which by the way now is 9 years since the beginning of the story, that Haman finally gets around to deciding he's going to get rid of the Jews. He throws the lots. First month, the 13th day of the month, which we call, of course, Nisan. This, by the way, is 2 days before Pesach. And on that day, again, we see that that Haman's decree goes out on the 13th day of the first month, 12th year of the reign of Achashverosh, is when the missives are sent. The next date that we have in the Megillah is after Esther's had all these parties and Haman's been hanged. And then finally Mordechai and Esther say, hey, we got to do something about this decree. The second decree is sent out by Chodesh Hashlishi, Chodesh Sivan, Bishlosh Aviaspimbo. No year is given because we know that this has to be sent out during that year because it's going to rescind a decree that is going to come due in that same year that Haman has sent it out in Adar. So we know that this month of Sivan is the same 12th year of the reign of King Achashverosh, and that these missives go out. Notice there is a 2-month period between the time the missives go out. One is in Sivan, the other is in Nisan. And perhaps we'll talk about that a little bit later also. And then finally, when we get to, where are we? Let's go here, please. Okay, let's go one more. When we finally get to Adar of that same year, on the 13th of Adar, which was the day it was supposed to happen, that's when all the wars happens. And there we have this famous phrase, that everything is turned topsy-turvy. Instead of the Jews being killed by their enemies, the Jews ruled over their enemies and were able to kill them. Okay, that's it. We know that the end of the story happens a year later because it's only a year later that the holiday becomes more than just a spontaneous celebration at the end of the fighting, and Mordechai, and we read that Mordechai establishes this whole holiday, or tries to get this whole holiday off the ground that is going to commemorate this in every year. So the whole period is set from the 3rd year to the 13th year, about 10 years, the whole story of the Megillah. Okay. So the question we have to understand is why all of these things why do we start with the story of Vashti? The Gemara gives a very interesting perspective. It tells us that the whole reason we have the story of Vashti is because if it hadn't been for the story of Vashti, the Jews would have been destroyed. And the rationale the Gemara gives is very simple. When Vashti is deposed, the king says, we're going to send out missives throughout the entire empire. What is the missive going to say? That every man is the ruler in his house. Nice missive. I need the king to tell me that the man is in charge in the house. Now, of course, the women all knew that this was nonsense, but it didn't matter because the king can think all he wants that the men are in charge of the household. The women all knew who's really in charge of the household. But now think about it. This is now a king codifying a law, spending the time to send dispatches. It wasn't just he posted it on the internet on the congressional record. He sent messengers, spent lots of money to print. Remember, they had to handwrite all of these missives, send them all out, deliver them all. It's a lot of expenses just to say that and they said, God, this king, I don't know. We better be careful with this king if these are the kinds of decrees he sends out. So the Gemara says, had he not sent out that decree, when Haman had sent out his decree to kill the Jews, there would not have been waiting. Why should we wait till Adar? Let's kill them all now. And that would have carried the day. But since they knew this king was a little bit interesting in his decrees, they decided to wait. Okay, he says, do it on 13th. Yes, sir, we'll do it on the 13th of Adar. And it's only because of that. So that's one reason why the story of Vashti is included. Now, another reason the story of Vashti is included, and I hope this should be my next thing, is it really gives us a very, very powerful contrast. And this is the whole story of what we see and what we look for behind between the lines. Okay, let's go to Esther chapter 1. Vashti was summoned. I start with Vashti makes a party also. She is summoned to come to the king. She says, I'm not coming. His result, when the messengers come back and say, she's not coming, you better, They just report. They don't say what you should do. It says, Vayiktof hamelech ma'od. He is very angry. It's not just he's upset. He's not just a little bent out of shape. He is like totally gone. The chamato ba'arabo. It's burning. His anger is burning within him. That's the phrase the Megillah uses. His anger is burning within him. Now, think about it. The king's just been offended by his queen in public, and all it says is chamato ba'arabo. He's angry. He's burning up. Now, he may or may not know how drunk he is. We don't know how cognizant he is of how drunk he is. But, come on, let's go. Why is my mouse always go the wrong way? So the king, what does he do? Now, what would you do if you were king? You were absolute ruler. You've just been totally offended by your wife. What would you do? Well, most people think, if again, the picture we have Achashverosh, the cross between Queen of Hearts and Henry, off with her head, right? No questions asked. Can't offend the king like that. I think Henry VIII killed a wife for less than that, just because she didn't have a male heir. Come on, go off with her head. She can't give me a board. Forget it. What kind of queen is that? So that's the picture we have. But the Achashverosh doesn't do that. That's not his response. His response is a very, very measured response. He calls his advisors. He says, wait a minute, I can't take this upon myself, even though I am the ruler. No, we Persians have rule of law. We go to the advisors, we call the council, let's see what the council has to say is the appropriate punishment. And that's exactly what he says. He brings them all these 7 advisors. What do we do about Vashti, who has not conformed to what the king told her to do? That the king sent these officers. She didn't do it. What do we do? Okay, now they deliberate. I don't know how much they deliberated. One of them gives an advice. We got to get rid of Vashti because she's going to start a feminist revolt in the whole kingdom. We're going to have all these women marching up and demanding everything. Forget it. We can't have this. We got to nip it in the bud. Let's get rid of Vashti before this all comes to fruition. And the women will get the hint that we men mean business here. And it says, it wasn't enough that the king thought it was a good idea. The advisors also agreed with it. And then, only after the advisors agree, then he does it. But again, notice that he's the one who's active. He doesn't delegate it to the advisors to do. He says, okay, I'm going to do it. So he takes charge and takes responsibility. But again, only after rule of law. He consulted with the advisors. We checked the precedents. This is what the result is, and that's what was done. Now let's see what happens at the end of the Megillah, toward the end of the Megillah, in a very, very seemingly similar state, okay? Again, we're now in chapter 7, second party. Achashverosh says to Esther, okay, what? Okay, I was nice. You invited a party yesterday, invited a party. What's this all about? Come on, let's get to the bottom line here. So Esther says, if I found favor in the eyes of the king, so this wonderful, passionate plea, please, if you think I'm good and I'm good, then you're going to give me my people, my soul, and my people is what I'm asking for, because we have been sold. And the king says, what are you talking about? Right? We all know the story. Wait, if I can get my mouse right. Okay. And again, and then Achashverosh indigently says to Esther, who is this guy who has the chutzpah to threaten my queen and her people? And she says, he's here, right here, this guy Haman. You remember him? What happens? Haman is very, very like shaking in his boots. He's pretty much, what do I do now? What do I get myself into now? But what is the king's response? Melech come again, there's that word again. At anger. He's boiling, but he doesn't do anything right away. He gets up, he walks out for a cup of air. He doesn't. So we think he's this impulsive, off with your. He's not. He waits a minute, but Haman now says, I only got one hope for clemency. I got to beg with Esther and tell her I didn't know she was Jewish, or I never would have had this decree or whatever. But suddenly the king comes back. He's tripped. He's fallen on her bed. And now the king has had it. He says, What are you trying to assault the queen here in the house, in the palace? You're come to assault the queen. And then when Charvona pipes up and says, oh, by the way, there's this tree that not only did Haman see attacking the queen, he wants to hang Mordechai, the best friend who we just made this parade for, remember, on this gallows. Not only is it a gallows, it's gallows 50 amot high. And the king immediately doesn't call any council meeting, does what he says, Taluhu Allah. So again, a lot of irony here in this story. Queen doesn't listen to king. He wants the advisors to be involved in the decision before he makes it. Advisor threatens his queen. That's it, off with his head. No advisors, no nothing, let's get it done here. So again, a lot of irony, and I think that's another reason why we have the whole story of the first chapter to give us this irony. You know, the story is that the king kills his queen because of his advisors, and he kills his advisor because of his queen. So again, irony, turnabout. That's the whole story of Purim, being able to see beyond the surface. By the way, Charvona, for those of you who've forgotten where Charvona appeared before in this chapter, his name only appears twice in the Megillah. Once in chapter 1, he is one of the 7 people sent to call Vashti, and he is the one who happens to notice, by the way, that there's this tree. Now, we have a little line at the end of Shoshana Yaakov, that little piyut that we say at the end of Megillat Esther, which ends with the lines, V'gam Charvona Zachor Latov. Charvona should be remembered for good. And the answer obviously is because, well, had he not said that, who knows whether Haman would have been able to bribe his way out if the king hadn't immediately executed him. But the question is, how did Charvona know that the tree was intended for Mordechai? I'm going to ask everybody that. How did Charvona know that the tree was intended for Mordechai? How did he know that Haman was planning on hanging Mordechai? Now, it may have been obvious from, the fact that he loved Mordechai so much, okay? But how did he know that? Definitively, he says, he doesn't ask, he says, I think he made it for Mordechai. He says he made it for Mordechai. So there are a lot of different interpretations, different possibilities. One possibility, the seemingly logical possibility, is he was also was he one of the chamberlains who was called Vashti, but he was one of the ones who was called to call Haman to the second party. When they arrived, if you remember back at the end of the chapter before the second party, what was Haman doing? He had just gotten back from walking Mordechai around town. He calls his advisors together immediately, says, I just had this interaction with Mordechai. What do I do now? And they said, you're in trouble. Is what they said. And then the advisors come and schlep him off too. So perhaps he may have overheard the advisors saying the rest of what they said, which isn't recorded in the Megillah. You better get that tree taken down now before the king finds out it was intended for Mordechai. And that's how he knew. That's what the people who want to say, okay, Charvona is not such a terrible guy. The other ones who really want to say that the reason we have to say Charvona is Zachor Latov is because if we didn't say that, people would really, Charvona was one of Haman's conspirators in the whole plot to get rid of Mordechai. That's how we knew who the tree was for. So that's the two opposite opinions on Charvona. One is he was an innocent bystander who happened to have good hearing. The other is that he was one of Haman's henchmen and realized, the ship is sinking, time to desert. So take your pick on which you like, but in either case, he has to be remembered for good, because as a result, Haman gets disposed and deposed right away. So let's move on to the next series of ironies in terms of why different things are in the story. Okay, I think the ultimate irony is the decree itself, which is what the next kata talks about. Haman sends out a decree to destroy the Jews. The Jews send out a decree to destroy Haman and his followers. The two decrees are worded almost exactly alike, except for, it could have been like they had a blank form. A law to destroy enemies. Here's how it's worded. Here's the text. Just insert enemy here and person who's doing the killing here. And you're finished. And by the way, make sure you date it and put a timestamp on it so it's official. And that's exactly the way it's worked. If you look here, it's all the same exact wording. Notice I've highlighted in green the words that are exactly the same. There are a number of words that aren't highlighted in green that are similar. The difference is Haman sends it to the Achashtar and the Pachot, Mordechai sends it to the Achash Tarbanim and the Pachot in one copy, the same copy, whereas Haman wrote two copies, one for, I guess, the governors, one for the sub-governors. Mordechai sends the same copy to both of them. That's why it's listed that way. The officers on all the different kates, but there's one difference that's very interesting. In Haman's case, everything is passive. Nichtav, it was written. V'nechtam, it was sealed. V'nishloach, and it was sent out. Haman left the administrative work, he delegated it. When Mordechai writes the missive to the Jews that's going to save their lives, he realizes he's involved in a very, very significant mitzvah, and he wants to be active. He does not delegate. It says, Vayichtov, Mordechai wrote the decree. Vayachtom, he took the king's ring and sealed it. Vayishlach, he instructed the messengers who were going out because he understood this was a very great mitzvah that he was involved in, and he wanted to be personally involved. Again, another irony. Haman is sort of like delegating, whereas Mordechai wants to be directly involved. I think it's a lot. I guess it makes sense. If you're saving people, if you're Raul Wallenberg, you want to do it directly yourself. If you're Adolf Eichmann, you want to delegate it. So it clearly makes sense, this wording. But again, if you don't look for that wording, look for that, you don't even see that nuance in the story. Another very, very clear irony. The Gemara makes this first irony in terms of Nichtav and Nechtam even more by the fact that saying that Achashverosh wanted to kill the Jews just as much as Haman did. And so he delegates it to Haman. You do the dirty work. I don't want God to be mad at me. You do the dirty work. Fine. You want to do it? Be my guest. And that's why he says, you don't need to pay me for this. No, I'm not taking any money for this. You do it. You take the dirty work. You take God's wrath. Just a sidelight, since I mentioned the Achashverosh being just as much an anti-Semite, at least according to that midrash. I just want to quote Ma'am Loes, who says that, by the way, you should know that Achashverosh wasn't really an anti-Semite the same way Haman was. The reason Achashverosh was an anti-Semite, if you want, was because his astrologers had told him that a Jew was going to succeed him on the throne. And Achashverosh could only imagine the only way a Jew was going to succeed him on the throne was if the Jews rebelled against him and overthrew him and they picked their king. So therefore, Achashverosh was not in favor of the Jews. And when Haman said, let's get rid of him, he said, fine. Obviously, he didn't realize that he was going to marry a Jewish woman. His son was going to be Jewish and was going to become king after that. So perhaps when he found that out, his Jew hatred probably changed course. So just a sidelight, as I said, again, it's a midrash. It's not written in the Megillah that his astrologers told him. It's not written in the Megillah that his son became king who was Jewish after himself. That's all midrash, but interesting midrashim to think about. Food for thought. Okay. Finally, let's see where we go next here. I don't even remember what I have next. Okay, one more irony. I think the most this is what I have next. Yeah, I think the most interesting irony of the entire book of Megillah, the Megillat Esther, is Haman. Haman, turns out, is his own worst enemy. Okay, he is the one who gets himself into his own trouble. Because if we think of the two major things that happened to Haman on his way down, they are, he has to parade Mordechai around the town, pretty much public humiliation for him, the prime minister, if you will, the second to the king, having to schlep theoretically a commoner, maybe he was one of the king's officers, but he's a commoner, around town, parading him around town on a horse, and he was not allowed to delegate it. King gave him direct orders, you got to do it. Okay, so that, and obviously he's being hanged on this nice high gallows. And think about it, where did the gallows come from? Whose idea was it? Haman's idea. Whose idea was it to parade Mordechai around on a horse like that? Haman's idea. So the two things are his own thing. Interestingly enough, this title of chapter 6 is What a Difference a Day Makes. Okay, and I'm going to show you that right here. When Haman leaves party number 1, he is sameach v'tov lei. He's happy. He's joyous. What does he do? He wants to boast about all this. He immediately calls a party for his whole entourage. He tells them all of the things, everything. And he says, this stupid Mordechai, he bugs me. He just bugs me, this Mordechai. Okay, but when he gets to chapter 6, this is before party 2. When he comes home from the parade, it says, Nidchaf el beito, avel b'chafui rosh. He is in mourning. His head is covered. His head is bent down. He has been totally disgraced. And again, what does he do? It doesn't say he gathers everybody together here. It just says he just blurts out whoever's there. He tells them, yeah, you got to know what happened to me, man. It was just pretty bad. Anyway, so as I said, interestingly enough, he gets 2 pieces of advice from these 2 groups. One in chapter 5, when he's on the rise, make that tree. The second is exactly the opposite. You better dismantle the tree. 1 day later, that's the same advice they give him. If you think about it, you're going to fall before him, which basically says you better try to cut your losses and cut a deal here. You better plea bargain quickly before they throw the book at you. And the implicit message, obviously, is you better get the tree down as quickly as possible. Unfortunately, he didn't have time because they were still talking. They were still strategizing as to what the best way to placate Mordechai was, but it was too late. The king's advisor came in. They schlepped Haman to the new party. So again, the chapter, that was one difference a day makes. And again, the final, I think, point of the story is the clear involvement of Hashem is the first few verses of chapter 6. This is, by the way, if you read your halachot Megillah and you happen to be a Megillah reader, when you begin chapter 6, you are supposed to raise your voice. The reader is supposed to raise his voice a little bit higher, because this is the beginning of the miracle, where almost in song to God when we start chapter 6, because that is the night when Nadidash Nat Hamelech, the sleep of the king, was interrupted. Now again, I can obviously say, as we've said throughout the book, Hamelech, Hashem had a tough night, he couldn't sleep. I'm always want to suggest, based on the Gemara, why couldn't he sleep? Very simply, he was bothered by something. What was bothering him? Why was Haman at this point? And this was supposed to be a tete-a-tete, me and the queen. Damn that Haman. Who invited him? Well, she invited him. Damn it. What's going on? Why is she inviting Haman? And not only did she invite him today, she invited him tomorrow. What the hell is going on here? I don't trust this Haman. Are they plotting to overthrow, to kill me? Is that what's going to happen tomorrow? They're going to kill me? And he can't sleep, obviously. Then there's another medrash that says, by the way, that Achashverosh couldn't sleep because he kept having a recurring dream. And in the dream, Haman is coming in the middle of the night with a sword to kill him. That's the recurring dream he's having. Well, if you were having that dream, you'd probably have trouble sleeping too. So he brings the Chronicles, and why bring the Chronicles? Obviously, it was the most boring thing he could think of that would distract him. That's what everybody thinks. I think, okay, he wants to read the most boring book here. But no, the commentaries want to suggest that he is worried. He sees this dream. Haman's coming to kill him. Esther's just invited Haman. She's invited him again. There's a conspiracy. Don't I have any friends who would tell me about a conspiracy? Let's read my history, my personal records, and find out what happened. Is there somebody I did something to, or somebody who would tell me, do I have any friends? And he reads this about Vayimatzeh. Here's the other key word. Vayimatzeh katuv. It was found, passive. It doesn't say they were reading and they finally get to this story. No. When they opened the book, that was the page it was open to. Now, there's a midrash, a wonderful midrash about what it means by Vayimatzeh katuv. It was found written that the person doing the reading was no friend of the Jews. He happened to be, according to one midrash, none other than Haman's sons, one of Haman's sons. And this is the last story he wants to read about how Mordechai saved the king's life. So he's flipping pages, and the king finally says, what are you turning the pages for? Read where you're up to. So that's why he says, Vayimatzeh katuv. It was found written. Okay. The king immediately asks the people who are around him in the room, obviously there had to be some attendance there, what reward did Mordechai get? And they say, we don't know of any reward Mordechai got. And now what happens? The critical point of the plot is right here. The king says, who Who's in the courtyard? It's the middle of the night. Who is coming into the king's courtyard to have an audience with the king in the middle of the night? Remember, it says he couldn't sleep, right? They're reading to him, he can't sleep. Who's coming to the king in the middle of the night? None other than Haman. By the way, Ma'am Lois adds a very interesting insight to this story. He says, not only was Haman coming in the middle of the night abnormal for anybody, but it was doubly abnormal for Haman because Haman liked to be the last one to come in. Why? So that everybody would be there already to bow down to him. Unlike the teacher wants to get there first, so the rabbi gets there first, so the congregation doesn't have to stand up when he gets in. Haman wanted the daf to be the last one there, so that everybody had to stand up when he showed up and bow. So here he is coming in the middle of the night. And what is he coming for? By the way, the narrator tells us, Achashverosh has no clue why he's coming. Remember, Achashverosh only knows he had this dream. Can you imagine if he'd have let Haman speak, how much worse off Haman would have been? Haman is almost saved by the fact that the king interrupts him before he has a chance to ask the king to hang Mordecai on this tree. Now, he's just read that Mordecai is the one the king wants to give some honor to. Okay? The king, this officers tell him, by the way, stop it. The king's officers tell him, by the way, Haman is there. And the king says, okay, let him in. Let's see why he's coming in the middle of the night. But he doesn't let him say anything. The king says right away, I have a person I want to give honor to. What should I do for him? Now, Haman obviously makes a fatal mistake here by saying, who would the king want to give honor to? Why honor rather than prestige, position? Well, he must want to give some honor to me. Why would he ask me what honor he wants to give me? He doesn't bother. See, he's so caught up in himself and seeking honor that he doesn't even stop to think, wait, maybe it's somebody else. I better be careful what I say. He doesn't. He throws all caution to the wind, and he immediately gives this grand procession that is going to be given to this person honor. We all know the story. Wearing the king's clothes, riding the king's horse. And the first thing he says, Vasher nitan keter malchut rosho. He even mentions a crown. By the way, he doesn't mention the crown later on, but he does mention a crown originally. He kind of drops it. He must have seen the way the king looked when he said crown and drops it. But nonetheless, we see that Haman is digging his own grave very, very clearly. Again, one of the key ironies and key mysteries, or I guess I shouldn't say mystery, the key points that help us point to the fact that there's something afoot other than a simple palace intrigue here, that there's a hand of God running through all of this. So let's try to wrap this up. As I said, we clearly see in what happens to Haman, we clearly see this v'nahafochu, this topsy-turvy aspect of Purim. He wants this honor, he has to give it to somebody else. He wants to hang somebody else on a tree, he gets hanged on it. And the ultimate of all ironies is the real irony is Purim. What is it? Haman wants to get rid of the Jews, and what happens? We get a new holiday. Haman doesn't get anything except hanged. We get a new holiday, Mishloach Manot Yisrael, all sorts of wonderful things that all testify to the fact that we, the Jewish people, are still united. We are still around. Not only that, we even call the name of the holiday Purim al Shem HaPur, because he chose the day. That's the irony of ironies, is that we name the holiday after what he used to choose the day that he was going to destroy the Jews. And he and his son, the end irony is that clearly HaKadosh Baruch Hu is watching over the Jewish people. And with that, I have to remind us all that, again, even though Hashem saves the Jewish people, we do not say Hallel on Purim. Why? Because we're still under Persian rule. This is not a redemption of the nature of Pesach or a redemption of the nature where Hashem saves us from our enemies, and it's a savior where we are now in control of our destiny, like Hanukkah. Even though the destiny was short-lived, nonetheless, we were back in control of our own destiny for a period. Nonetheless, even so, we are told in the Megillah, which is prophetic, That the days of Purim will never be forgotten. And we hope and pray that we will be able to learn, I think, the most important lesson, that even though Hashem can save us from everybody else, still can't save us from ourselves. And if we don't get ourselves out of Galut and back home where we belong when we're given the opportunity, we're going to continue to face persecution and require sometimes miraculous savings from Hashem. And we really should be moving on beyond that rather than relying on these miraculous savings. So thank you all. Have a wonderful, wonderful Purim. And remember that Purim is a unique day of the year where everything is topsy-turvy, and we have to take advantage of that topsy-turviness to transform the simcha into a simcha that helps bring us closer to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and through that we can be zocha Gula Shlema again. Thank you very much. Questions, comments, feedback at this point in time. I apologize for the length, but if anybody has any questions or comments, please, I'm willing to go ahead. Anybody? I put everybody on mute. Wait, I have to unmute everybody. Nobody can talk because I muted everybody. I apologize. All right, anybody have any comments or questions they'd like to? Wait, I said unmute all. Why did it mute all? Wait a minute, nobody's unmuted. Hold on. Why? Wait. I want to unmute all. Oh no, I can't. Wait.
You can't.
Oh, everybody has to unmute themselves. If you have a question or comment, please unmute. All right. Okay. No questions, no comments?
Just thank you very much. Very
All right,
interesting.
thanks, Jackie. Hold on a second. Ron has a question. I apologize. Go ahead. Is there a medrash that says why Haman was at the palace in the middle of the night? The Megillah itself says he came because he was so anxious to get king's permission to hang Mordechai because he wanted to get Mordechai hanged up there before the party so he could see him, Mordechai, his enemy, dangling from the tree. The Megillah says he went to ask permission from Achashverosh to hang Mordechai. He couldn't wait. His advisors told him to wait till the proper time. But he was so anxious to get rid of Mordechai, that hatred, that anger was so strong that he immediately went to the king. Okay? All right. Okay, any other questions or comments? Okay, if not, happy Purim to all, and to all a good night.
Thank you.
Thank
Thank
you.
you all.
Very good.